Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to talk about memory encoding. And so the last lecture that you likely watched was about our memory models. And this should look familiar to you at this point. We have our three memory systems. And you may recall that I said when we take information from our short-term memory, that middle memory system, and we put it into our long-term memory, that arrow is called encoding. So that's what we're going to focus on today, encoding information into our long-term memory. So there's a nice definition for you there, simply the process of transferring information from short-term to long-term. We do it all the time, and some of you may be looking for strategies on how to be more efficient with this process. You're looking at your notes, you're studying, you're reading your textbook. How can I get this information from my short term, which might only last 10 minutes, to my long term that I know I can access months from now if I need it? Well, I said in our last lecture, one of the most common ways to encode is through the process of rehearsal. Well, there are actually two different types of rehearsal. The first type of rehearsal is what we call maintenance rehearsal. And maintenance rehearsal is simply when you repeat something over and over and over and over again. When I was in elementary school in third grade, we had vocab tests in third grade. And our teacher would give us a list of words on Mondays, and then on Fridays, sorry, it wasn't a vocab test, it was a spelling test. And on Fridays, we had to come in and she would say triangle, and we all had to know how to spell triangle. And I have a memory of sitting in Subway with my mother and just writing these words over and over and over again. I'd write the words 20 times until I knew it forwards and backwards. That is maintenance rehearsal. Maintenance rehearsal is great for learning some things. Most of your educational experience to this point has probably been a lot of maintenance rehearsal, where the teacher has told you something and then they want you to essentially regurgitate that information back in the exact same form at the end of the week or the end of the quarter or whenever that may be. If you're learning vocabulary, if you're learning state capitals, maintenance rehearsal works just fine. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Elaborative rehearsal, on the other hand, requires you to make connections. Elaborative rehearsal is when you are learning something new, you try to tie that information to other information you have already learned. And there's a lot of techniques that we can use for elaborative rehearsal, for making these connections. Maybe the connections are to personal experiences that you have had. Maybe the connections are to something visual that you can imagine in your mind. So we're going to go into some detail about elaborative rehearsal here in a little bit. But a big part of elaborative rehearsal is when we use this phrase called semantic encoding. Now, semantic means word meaning. It is understanding what words actually mean. If you don't know what a word means, it will be really difficult to recall and have true understanding of that information. I don't speak German. I could memorize 20 words in German, but I wouldn't be able to apply that information. I could memorize them if I used maintenance rehearsal and just repeated it every day for 3 weeks. I could say, here's 20 German words that I have learned. Well, I've memorized them, but I wouldn't be able to apply that information if I don't understand the information. So semantic encoding is when we understand the words, when we understand the information. And for classes like AP Psychology, it's important that you use elaborative rehearsal. It's important that you make those connections, because we're not going to ask you to simply regurgitate information. We want to make sure that you can actually apply that information to perhaps new ideas and new concepts. So as we encode information into long-term memory, sometimes that encoding requires a lot of effort. We have to be very conscious of it. Other times, this happens automatically, this unconscious processing of information. And let me give you an example of kind of what I mean here. Perhaps there's been a time in your life when you've been taking a test, and maybe it's about it's world history and it's about the Crusades. And they're asking you a question about the Crusades, and you can think, gosh, I remember exactly where that was in my notes. It was like on the right-hand side, kind of toward the top. I put a little red circle around it, but you don't remember what the actual information is. Well, you have encoded that information of where it is on the page automatically. You remember it days later, weeks later, and you didn't try to remember it, you just did. It happened automatically. It was unconscious processing. That doesn't always work though, right? Sometimes when we're trying to encode, we have to use conscious effort. It has to be effortful. You have not consciously tried to remember the order of events that have happened this past summer. And yet, I bet you could tell me a brief timeline of your summer. Well, at the beginning of the summer, I did this, and then in the middle, we went to the lake, and then toward the end, I did X, Y, and Z, and blah, 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 right? Well, you have automatically memorized that timeline of events. But memorizing key terms in AP Psych will probably require effortful processing. It requires conscious thinking in order to encode it into our long-term memory. And so our last slide today is just, let's talk about some of these strategies to help you encode. You want to get that information from your short-term memory into your long-term memory. What are some ways to make you better with this process? Well, a very popular strategy to use when encoding is the use of mnemonics. You've likely been doing this from elementary school. A mnemonic is a memory aid. That's all it is. It's actually something else you have to remember, but for one reason or another, it's easier to remember. Maybe it's because you have made an acronym, some silly sentence, right? If you are familiar with, every good boy deserves fudge, and that helps you remember the scales in music. If you remember never eat soggy waffles for northeast, southwest, there's tons of mnemonics in math class, right? These are memory aids. Sometimes it's a little riddle, sometimes it rhymes, sometimes it's an acronym, sometimes it's something visual. It's an extra piece of information that helps you remember the content you're trying to remember. It's a lot easier to encode things that are visual as opposed to encoding things that are abstract. And so if you can create some kind of image in your mind, that's going to help you as well. So a lot of times in class, and you'll hear me say this, especially in things like biopsych, I'll say, okay, picture this. Imagine it looking like this, right? So one thing we're going to do, for example, is we're going to learn about what's called the hippocampus. It's a part of your brain. Well, just the word hippocampus is very abstract. You likely don't have a visual for the hippocampus. But if I tell you to imagine a hippopotamus walking across a college campus, well, now you're starting to create something visual in your brain. It's a lot easier to remember when we do things like that. The spacing effect is this idea that we are more likely to encode information if we space that information across time. Not necessarily across content. That has a different term, which we'll talk about here in a second. But the spacing effect, we are more likely to remember information if we space it across time. Some of you may be guilty of cramming for 2 or 3 hours the night before a test. I've done it too. The reality is, if you have a ton of content, at some point it's too much and you're not going to be able to remember. It is much better to study for 10 or 15 minutes a night for a week before a test as opposed to 3 hours the night before. You need to allow your brain time to comprehend and process the information. You need to space the information out over time. So as you're preparing for the AP exam, make sure that you're spending a little bit of time every night, every other night, rehearsing information and allowing yourself to process that. We're more likely to remember things if they have some kind of personal impact. If there is a list of random nouns, right, random objects, and I have you try to memorize them, that can be kind of tricky. But if you are given the prompt, which of these items have you owned before? Well, now there's some kind of personal connection to them, right? And so the self-reference effect is the idea that you are more likely to remember things if you have a connection. I give lots of examples in class, and maybe I'm giving an example that talks about playing soccer. Well, if you play soccer, you may be more likely to then remember that term because the example applies to you. It's one of the reasons why you're taking notes. You want to try to come up with your own examples. I try to give lots of examples. You want to come up with your own examples so that they apply to you. Chunking is kind of like the spacing effect. The spacing effect deals with time. Chunking deals with information. The idea behind chunking is you take a huge list of information and you divide it into meaningful chunks. For example, we're going to talk about over 30 different parts of the brain, and that can be daunting to think, I'm going to have to memorize over 30 different parts of the brain. But don't think of it as memorizing over 30 different parts of the brain. Think of it as you have to memorize 4 different lobes of the brain. You'll need to have to memorize 3 different parts of the cortex. You'll have to memorize 4 different parts of the hindbrain. You'll have to memorize 6 different subcortical structures, 2 different parts of the language areas. And so we chunk it out. It's the same amount of information, but it's easier for your memory to organize it into meaningful parts. Maybe you are trying to remember all of the professional football teams. And so you go through chunks. You start to think about the different divisions, and then it's easier to remember, oh, these are the 4 teams in the AFC West. And then you work your way through the process in chunks. And then last, what we call the method of loci is a really interesting memory technique. There are some things that are ingrained in your memory that are physical. Imagine your house, your apartment, your home, whatever it may be. You can close your eyes and you can imagine walking from the front door to the living room, to the kitchen, to your bedroom, wherever it may be. You already have that memorized. Well, the method of loci is when you take information and you imagine placing it throughout a very familiar location. Think method of loci, familiar location. So maybe you're trying to memorize a grocery list. Well, one thing on that grocery list is eggs, another thing is milk, and then bread. You can imagine walking up to your front door and someone has smashed eggs all over that front door. And then you walk into the living room and your living room is flooded. You're up to your hips in milk. And then you walk into your bedroom and someone stole your bed and they replaced it with a giant loaf of bread. Well, it sounds really goofy, but the reality is it helps your memory. When you go to the grocery store, you can close your eyes. You can imagine just walking through your home. Think, well, the first place I went was my front door. Oh, yeah, there were eggs all over the front door. I got to pick up some eggs. My living room was flooded with milk. Oh, I got to pick up some milk. So you just imagine walking through this location to help you remember these different things. And that's what we call the method of loci. All right, lots of information to help you encode. Hopefully you use some of these strategies and get this information from your short-term memory into your long-term memory. As always, if you have any questions, send me an email, ask a friend, check out your textbook. Don't forget about that one, and best of luck.